Well, uh, hi, I am Mike. I will be your host for today. I am the first year PhD student from T Labs in Monash. I will then hand it to Chuyin.
And my name is Chuyin. I'm also a PhD student from the same lab as Mike and Kallum.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's oh,
Oh, sorry, Kallum go first. Yeah.
hi, my name's Kallum. I'm an honors student, also in the same lab.
Right. And I'm Vishaal, master's student in the same lab as well.
All right. So today we are reading the paper Emotion Semantics Show Both Cultural Variation and Universal Structures. In this paper, the author tries to tackle the central debate on to what extent does the cultural environment or our biology shapes our emotions. So on one hand, our emotion, we understand to some degree that our emotional experience is shaped by physiological processes. And since all humans share a somewhat similar biology, it would suggest that we should share a somewhat similar emotional experience. But on the other hand, we live in a society, and the understanding of emotions and the ability to be able to make inferences on what other people's emotion is an important aspect of social interactions. And how do we learn about these skills and knowledge about emotions? Well, we learn through the society itself. It learns through the cultural and media it produces. This is what one may call a connectionist approach. Now, there are quite a lot of previous studies that have tried to tackle this very problems using human subjects, but they suffer from a variety of issues. For example, they tend to lack ecological validities. They are conducted in a laboratory environments where the participants are, for example, asked to make a facial expression based on a certain emotions. The participants are not actually feeling those emotions, but since the researcher have asked, they have to exaggerate and they have to manufacture these expressions. And this would not be what's happening if in a more naturalistic environment. Another problem is that these human subject studies tend to suffer from a mixed results. The results coming from one group of comparison states this, from the another group shows bigger variabilities. And who's to believe, right? Perhaps the biggest problem is that these human subject studies tend to be quite expensive. Therefore, they can only be conducted between two groups in most cases. And we know that there are a lot of group runners from all different cultures speaking all sort of languages. Two group, is it representative of the entire human experience? Not necessarily. Therefore, the author of this paper tried to tackle this problem by studying natural human languages from different cultures. But there is an additional methodological problems on how do you judge the relation between two words from two different languages. In the study of language, what often what we do in a single language is that you can ask participants to rate similarities or associations between two words, and you can construct a semantic space based on these ratings. But how do you do it when there are multiple different languages? It seems the author used the methods called collexifications. Essentially, it involves finding these words that contains multiple concepts. In English, I guess one example would be, let's say, the verb draw. It could be drawing on paper. You are making some kind of painting, or drawing water from wells. You are pouring a bucket of water from a well. They are the same word, but two different concepts. Now, the assumption is that if a single word can describe multiple concepts, then these concepts must be semantically similar in some way, right? And based on how many these collectificated words there are, you can create a network model based on that for different languages. And you will see, hopefully, these communities with tightly connected words. For example, one example is that in Indo-European languages, they found that grief, anxiety, fear, anger, all these words are very tightly connected. And in a different language, perhaps the connection is very much different. For example, in the Austro-Asiatic, you can still see some similar connections like regret, grief, anxiety. They are tightly connected, but you don't see anger connected to this community anymore. Based on these communities, we can determine the variabilities of emotional words from one language to another. And the first finding that they found is that comparing to color concepts, emotional concepts seems to have much higher variabilities. Perhaps it's not entirely surprising, considering that color concepts tend to be perceived as something more concrete in comparison to emotions. Their second finding is that the geography, the geographical location of a language actually is a very strong predictors of these variabilities between languages. The author explained that if there are similarities between the geographical locations of two languages, it's probably likely that people who speak these languages are located geographically close to each other as well. Whether through common ancestry or cross-cultural communications, they probably share some kind of cross-cultural bonds, and therefore they should perceive or conceptualize emotions in somewhat similar ways. And the third finding is that they found that valence and physiological activations are also two very strong predictors of of emotional experiences across different cultural groups and languages. Valence refers to the pleasantness and unpleasantness of an emotional experience, and activation refers to what sort of activation, physiological activation, physiological arousal is associated with this emotion. For example, sadness would be an unpleasant emotion that's not very physiologically arousing, right? And they found that these two scales are very much universal across different language and culture groups. And I think that's it. In conclusion, it seems that the authors found that very much supportive evidence for this constructionist approach to emotions. Yeah, and that's the paper. Anything that everybody want to add or correct?
I would say the only thing is that concept of valency, which they cite as a kind of they cite kind of valency and activation, valency and arousal as like the driving sort of features of this variation. That valency in the context of linguistics is quite an odd one, I think. It's kind of how many arguments a single verb can take in a language, as I understand it. So there's like the valency theory, valence kind of theory of linguistics or of grammatical theory, which is that like verbs structure sentences by pulling together elements in like the same way that I suppose an atom does pull electrons around. That's the idea.
Oh,
But
that's
here
actually
but here they're referring to emotional valence, right? Which
Is that
basically how positive or negative the concept is, or am I misunderstanding that?
I thought that was the hedonic
Yeah.
aspect.
So just to clarify, so because we don't really, our expertise are not in the linguistic aspect. So this hedonic pleasantness is not actually refers to actual pleasantness, or is there a specific message behind how they come to the conclusion of what valence should an emotional experience be?
I believe so. The quote that's in the introduction they say is, according to these models, valence and activation reflect basic neurophysiological processes that signal when the body shifts from homeostasis. And the universal importance of these processes may lead all languages to differentiate emotions primarily on the basis of their degree of valence and activation. As I understand it, that paper that they cite at reference 9, which is quite a interesting assumption that they take, because I think that paper is kind of controversial, at least as I took the time to read it because it was interesting. And as I understand it, yeah, valence is sort of this way that arguments are developed through verbs. It's like a theory in linguistics that some people take. And activation, as they say, this degree of valence and activation, where activation is sort of the physiological arousal that's associated with experiencing an emotion. So the idea is that valence and activation closely linked to physiological processes, because the way that your emotion, like these emotions like anger or something, change your physiology or fell in your physiology, which are at least the authors deem as sort of more essential, and then kind of drive the development of language. But I think that's built on a lot of assumptions.
Yeah,
Mm, right. In the studies of words, yeah, they are also related to some latent factors that organize words. Usually, it also involves a term called valence, and I suppose it's slightly different from the valence we know from emotions, but it's quite hard to explain in words. Um, I don't think this hedonic pleasantness is different from the valence in emotions.
The valence in emotions is positive or negative.
Yeah, but valence in words is also referred at negative and positive things. Uh, so
well, I'm a little bit confused here. So the valence that they're using here is the emotional valence, right? It's not
Is
the
that right? I think it's quite, I couldn't tell.
I think
okay.
it's from emotions because it says constructionist models of emotion. It says emotion models.
So emotional valence and hedonic valence mean the same thing here. Is that it?
Uh,
Or am I misunderstanding it? Let me just look it up right now.
yeah, we probably shouldn't go into much details of this. It's because it's
Well, I
if
think
you
that they use that as one of the kind of in the conclusion, like this is one of their main predicates for the development of language. This is like a central tenet to their argument, is that they find evidence for an underlying structure in the meaning of emotion concepts across languages, and they attribute that to valence and physiological activation, which is supposed to mean that these aspects of emotion semantics are linked to some neurophysiological system that's built to maintain
yeah.
homeostasis, and that's like interoception.
Yeah, but they didn't say whether or not this valence is about or say the study is about the meaning of words or the actual feelings. Yeah. It's like uh, I'm not sure if you can sense the difference between this meaning of words and feelings after seeing these words. Yeah.
Hmm. And so you were saying the emotional experience and the words themselves. Is that?
Yeah, kind of thing.
Mm.
Mm,
I'm actually a bit curious because the author seems to be like essentially considering them as the same thing in this case, right?
really? I think they are.
Are they? I mean, the the entire constructionist argument and their methodology, it seems to imply that they are considering the two as well, essentially the same thing, or at least
Um,
functionally the same thing.
mm, yeah. In terms of that, right? In a way, yeah. I say in a way, yes. Uh, again, I can sense a bit difference between this concept, but I can't really explain by words. Uh,
I guess it could be interesting if we go in further into this discussion on how this emotion is attached to the physiology. Um, so in this case, I'm actually a bit uncertain because while the author suggested that valence and these activations, they're all constructionist models, right? But it sounds very much related to the underlying biology, right? Or am I confused in this aspect?
ah, you mean the six factors?
Hmm.
Yeah, among the six factors, right? I
In
guess
in
I
the
guess
constructionist model, the component that is closely related to a physiological process, it's the core effect, which also only contains valence and arousal. Yeah.
Hmm.
And built upon core effect, if these six factors are from the constructionist model, they are a part of the cognitive process. I mean, not
Are
that
you
different.
are you referring to the statement that valence and physiological activation are constraints to the variability of emotional semantics? Is that the sentence you're referring to?
And sorry, can you repeat the question?
No. So what what you brought up right now? I think Mike mentioned something about
Yeah,
physiological activity.
physiological
Yeah,
process.
yeah. As I understand it, the idea is like early theories kind of say that there's like some universal emotions, and that
Yeah,
language is developed to express them. There's like,
yes,
anger, sadness,
yes,
happiness, whatever. And these are like essential neurobiological processes. Like these
yes,
emotions are felt
probably.
as a result of the way our brain is like constructed.
Yes,
But then
probably.
new theories would be like there's kind of systematic variation in meaning and experience across culture and language. I believe they say something similar to that. And the idea is that language is developed by like social inference of physiological processes and not like some essential thing. So it's like this concept, it's like interoception concept where the brain is like I'm not like I read into
Interpret.
it for the brain is like attempting to maintain like homeostasis, and certain emotions or certain
Mm,
physiological states like consume more
yeah,
energy.
that's one of the core differences between the basic emotion theory and
Uh,
constructive models. Yes,
yes,
like
it's
the
like
emotion is driven.
allosteric consumption.
Yeah. Uh,
But but that kind of applies like a certain assumption that the I don't know, emotions are like uniformly consume energy in the same way that, and that the brain is somehow acting like independently of these emotions to conserve or to otherwise redirect that energy elsewhere, which I think is still controversial, no?
Right. It's not conclusive. Yes.
Yeah.
So can
And
can
they kind of provide support for that theory in this paper because the idea is that like these language groups are colexified or kind of cluster largely, like their differences are largely based on valence and activation or arousal. So languages it kind of
Yeah.
suggests that there's some common like psychophysiological dimension or there's some like universal constraints because like languages tend to cluster around like the similar like physiological process, so to say.
yes, which is why I was initially confused because it seems to sort of provide evidence for both the diversity of emotional experience and at the same time these underlying physiological processes.
I think that's because like the underlying like there are multiple ways to address the underlying physiological processes, and that's kind of how languages construct independently from one another. And in this case, they say like geography is a way that you can cluster them because like social contact and like social communities influence one another, and like the way in which their languages develop or kind of colexify is because different cultures like clash or whatever or just exist kind of spatially in the same area.
Hmm.
That requires some assumptions, like the
Yes.
author said. Yeah, language. I mean, the emotion terms in languages was should be built upon this physiological processes and some social factors or so, that kind of assumption.
Mm.
Yeah, if we take those assumptions, I would say, yeah, this makes sense. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, but again, it seems odd, like the degree to the assumptions that they're kind of relying on. Uh,
Mm.
but still,
Um,
the results are kind of they're still quite nice, right? Like the maps they make are still quite
Yeah.
like they are still kind of compelling. But I wonder also to the extent like how there's like implicit translation in this whole document. It's written in English, and they're comparing languages from all kinds of language groups and still applying sort of English labels to these emotions. And it's like, how much are we able to separate? Because it relies on like sort of context. Like
that's actually a very good point, I feel like, because, well, I guess it depends on how much variability there is, and the study seems to suggest very much. Like if there's entirely, that's hypothetically speaking, if there in one culture there's entirely different emotional experience that's essentially absent in a different culture, then there's no way to make the connections almost. Of course, in reality, that's probably not the case. There probably are some kind of connections, but whether it's good to present, well, you have to present the result in some language. I guess that's the only realistic thing to do, but it may alter how we understand it, I guess.
hmm. Yeah, there's another thing is that they take the assumption of like colexification as their entire sort of methodology that their whole way of conceiving like language similarity or this sort of construction is through colexification, where they just say that two concepts are perceived as conceptually similar if they share the same word, like they share the same, but a lot of words don't follow that, kind of that definition, like bear in English. there's a lot of different words, but they are nevertheless sort of co-lexified. They kind of cite more broadly like languages lexify like sea and water together. Lots of languages have similar words, but like, I mean, in English, you don't. There you go. Like they're not, again, they're not co-lexified. Some languages, I'm sure some languages definitely do, and maybe a majority do, but then like, it seems like I wonder, it's like intuitively, I feel like they're going to average out a lot of kind of real data by making that assumption.
I'm just
there's a detail I actually wanted to add to Mike's summary. So it looks like the authors are comparing between language families rather than individual language. But what Kallum just said was about some individual languages like English. It's
No, they
not,
do. They do study individual. They study 2,474 individual languages, but they group them in like in those graphs in clusters by group, by language family.
yeah, and their comparisons are based on families, language families, right? They are
Are
not
they?
they are not
Yeah.
making any comparisons
No.
between individual
The
languages.
comparisons is between family groups, families, language families.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, it's very easy to find the examples like you just said from individual languages, but the authors,
True.
it's not looking at that fine level. They are looking at a more a more abstract level, language families. Yeah.
True.
Mm,
So basically, they are comparing the collexification network graph that they made, right?
mm.
Between families, and as well as geometric proximity. No,
Yeah,
geographic proximity.
yeah, I think the geographic distance is
Yeah,
the
geographic.
point the authors wanted to emphasize. That's what I feel. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm,
But I mean, it
yeah.
makes sense, right? Like the closer you are from one culture to another, the more similar your language is gonna be, and it's gonna be.
Mm.
And the more distant, yeah, and so it's basically in line with what they're saying. So
Yeah,
yeah.
but even I guess like even comparing on that level, like
Mm.
they've put Indo-European as like one language family. Um, Indo-European's like all the Romance languages, like all the Germanic languages, Greek, I'm pretty sure is an Indo-European language. Like
And
it's a pretty
I'm not
broad
sure.
scope. Like
yeah, it includes like
Iran,
10
like
groups, maybe.
I
Actually,
don't know,
one of
like
the
what the
examples. Sorry, Kallum, you go
yeah,
first.
no, like even like Sanskrit, like Gujarati, like
Yeah.
Punjabi, they're technically Indo-European because it's like all across that peninsula. Like to what extent like I don't know, even just I'm not sure the extent to which they're able to like on what assumptions are they building these comparisons? Because I think that's a pretty broad church to try and make like sweeping claims of oh, well, this language colexifies it this way. I'm not sure. It'd be interesting if we had a linguist, to consult, because I'm not sure the degree to which like Iranian languages are similar to French.
I will say it should be much more interesting to compare between individual languages. But maybe
Mm.
for some reasons like the capability to compute, and that kind of realistic reason the authors didn't do that. But
On
I think
a
they can. Yeah.
Yeah, did they
on a
state?
very sorry, Kallum, yeah.
No, did they state like why they didn't do it per
Mm,
language?
I don't know. Maybe in the supplementary material, but not in the main text. I didn't find anything. Yeah.
Hmm.
On a very, very small note, it will be interesting to compare these language groups to, like, for example, the authors, they highlighted one example in one instance where the valence for the word pity is closely associated with love, and it's viewed
Mm.
as positive, when in actuality it's the opposite for almost all the other collexification patterns. So, like, diving into those kind of differences where there's like a distinct difference opposite in the valence or something would be very interesting to look at, I think. Yeah. Just a thought, yeah. Like
Mm.
how does the how does culture influence that specific group, and their perception of emotion? Of course, that was just one example. So what are the concepts do they see quite differently compared like to the rest of these groups? Yeah.
Oh, ideally, like a qualitative study may be able to view some of the finer connections
But then the
within
problem
these.
is if they, as they already identify in the introduction, like a qualitative study kind of is exposed to serious bias.
Well, yeah, but you have to, I mean, is there a quantitative study that, I mean, we can ask the participant from this language group to rate similarities, and hopefully their result will reflect this connection between pity and love. That would be the other way I can think about.
Mm. If they are just doing language families and they're looking to co-lexify terms, I wonder how they choose what's appropriate, right? Because I'm sure the English word for like love is entirely different to like just the word itself is different to like the Iranian word for love. I wonder kind of on what
I,
how they're
I
actually co-lexifying.
I suppose the information is in the supplementary materials, but
Yeah.
I guess it will be very technical.
Hmm.
Mm, it depends.
The
To
supplementary
understand,
materials is about 35 pages.
yeah, and they also mentioned the data set. It's called cross-linguistic colexifications. And yeah, you need to also look at the data set to see what the structure of the data is. Yeah.
Hmm. It's true.
Mm, anyway, I mm,
I'm kind of wondering whether these language groups may share some kind of um, characteristic for their correlate words, if that makes sense. Whether some of these connections are not necessarily because of the different emotional conceptualization, but reflects how concepts are coalesced in the word in this language families. Perhaps because of the syntax or the way words are constructed. Um, Perhaps that may have an effect. That was also sort of mixed up in the analysis and
mm,
presented as an emotional effect.
mm, mm. Uh, we can't answer that, right?
Yeah,
No.
just food for thought.
Yeah, yeah. Mm, and I also I have a feeling. I when I read this paper, I felt strange about the authors using geographic distance. And then after reading the whole paper, realized I realized that the reason is they use the term cultural variation in their title. So I suppose the paper will be discussing cultural influence, but instead they are only focusing on the language. And I think language is a part of the culture, but the difference between cultures is much more complicated. I haven't read any methods to quantify, say, the similarity between cultures. Have any of you heard that kind of thing to
Oh,
compare the similarity between cultures rather than language? Because I see a lot of interchangeable usage of the term different languages and different
Hmm.
culture. The researchers seem
mhm.
seem to equalize these two terms, but I think it's not entirely true. Cultures
Actually,
are much more complicated. Yeah.
yeah, actually, now that you raised that, it's very, very possible that for a specific language group, you can also have a specific language group and a specific and its associated geographical location. You can also have multiple ethnic groups within a given.
Yeah, there are
Yeah,
many
Oh
interesting
yeah, and
examples. Like,
yeah,
yeah,
like second, like someone who learns a different language, like you don't adopt their culture, like the
yeah, yeah.
culture of the language that you speak immediately, it's a different
yeah,
thing.
yeah. Or say three countries, China, Japan, and Korea. These three countries in the Eastern Asia, I mean, globally, they are seen as having similar cultures, but actually their languages are from three different families. The Chinese, I think Chinese from Sino-Tibetan families, and Korean Japanese are from, say, they don't have clear language family, and that's a very interesting examples. And also some other thing like Italy and Spain, their languages are quite similar, but culture-wise, I don't think so. Yeah.
Hmm.
Oh,
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, like I think Italy and Spain are probably closer than like Japan and China.
you mean in terms
Like
of language or culture? Yeah,
culturally, but
yeah,
then like how do you, yeah, it's pretty impossible to define. Like it's pretty messy, and I'm sure if you actually asked someone from these cultures, they'd probably
yeah,
be
yeah. And
have a different thought about it.
that's why I feel it's much more interesting to compare between individual languages, because you can
Yeah,
directly look at these very interesting examples. But by comparing between families, it's less intuitive. We can't. I mean, it's less concrete. Yeah, we can't give
yeah,
examples.
yeah.
Mm,
That's a good flag. Yeah.
yeah. That's a good point. And it's also like they don't really engage in culture like at all. And I suppose the
mm,
ways that a language family, like the language group, may conceive of like the
mm,
meanings of emotions or feel things, maybe that some culture feels like, where they say like that being proud is closer to good, whereas proud might be, somewhere else might be near bad. I think that's
mm.
a difference between like Austroasiatic and Indo-European. Um, you might be able to like make some assumptions about the way the culture is, but I don't
Mm.
think that that's like terribly appropriate or even really possible. Like to say that Indo-European language, like Indo-European people, cultures, which are, as we've already said, as broad as
Yeah,
the Indian subcontinent to France, like see that pride is a bad feeling. I think compared to what someone else who thinks pride is good. I don't
yeah.
know, you just can't do it. There's like almost no point.
So to me, or say to us, and I think a more promising pathway to future studies, it's the second point mentioned by the
Hmm.
authors. So since our findings also raise the intriguing possibility that emotion experience vary systematically across cultural groups. So it's focused on an emotion experience, or say for linguistic people, it can be related to the Wolf hypothesis, and it says the language spoken by a certain group of people will influence their perception, their mind, maybe their conscious experience. So it's a hypothesis called Wolf hypothesis. Mm, yeah, that's what I get from what I get and what I feel from this paper. Yeah, this
Hmm.
this pathway sounds more interesting and promising to me. Yeah. Mm, right.
Mm, Just quickly, just get into perhaps a little bit specific, sorry.
Okay.
I find it a little bit weird in the Indo-European language group. The emotion hope is clustered with grief, fear, anxiety, anger, regret, and pity.
Yeah.
I'm not sure
Um,
why. And it's
Yeah, I think this is kind of one of the reasons why this study or this like approach is so kind of
Yeah,
unsatisfying. Is it
and
like you could maybe think of a way that you could put them together, but then you'd be ignoring like all the other kind of social ways that they would not go together?
and we can't answer that because we only
Yeah.
speak one or two languages from
Yeah.
this family. Yeah.
Like,
By the way, Kallum, besides English, what else? What other language do you speak? Do you know a little?
German.
German?
Yeah.
So yeah, so like you know two languages from Indo-European family, but
Yeah.
can you feel this connection?
No.
Yeah,
No,
yeah.
yeah, not at all. Like, and also even, and that's what I was trying to express before is that like even like German and English are both Germanic languages,
Yeah.
but Germanic languages feel very different to like Romance languages like French, even though they're all Indo-European.
Yeah, yeah.
So even
I
within these groups, there's so much like splitting.
I suppose this figure Indo-European contains more than a hundred individual languages, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe. No one can intuitively explain and feel this connection or so, I
Hmm.
guess.
but I feel like for computational sake, you have to cluster them together to have enough collect words to make this whole analysis work, right? If you only have like 20 languages, there just may
Mhm.
not be enough words for you to create this sort of a network model.
And
I mean, there's a lot of words. Like
yeah, a lot of
there's a lot of words, like also that are
Yeah, but
beyond the average person's lexicon, but that nevertheless are still words in the dictionary. And that the dictionary is kind of the way that these, as I understand it, as they kind of describe the way they sort of
yeah.
colexify things is by analyzing the ways that individual words are translated and then finding another word that is translated the same in another language.
Yeah. And I think yeah, also many synonyms.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
is there any other discussion we want to have? Wait, well, actually, that would be very interesting if you can do it in like a historical, like you can look back at the past of the language and you try to collect words from the past and you compare it with the present and you see how the language evolved and you perhaps maybe it suggests that how conceptualization of emotion has changed in this culture. Be quite
Hmm.
interesting.
Mm.
Yeah. Hmm. I see. By the way, regarding what Mike said, I think I remember another group from Uni Melbourne. It's doing kind of that kind of things, but it's not about emotions. It's about climate. You get the
Oh,
sense like, yeah, historically, the climate, the connection between climate and their geographic locations reflected in their languages. It's that kind of thing. Yeah.
yeah. I was told by my father that back in China, there's a Chinese group doing roughly similar thing, try to derive the condition of climates based on the writing itself. But yeah, it's quite
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
Perhaps not that
Yeah,
interesting.
historically, there are many other interesting topics like climate and the pandemic. That, Mm, right.
Right.
Mm,
Are there any other points that we want to cover? There, everybody's happy, or
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
all right. Well, thanks for coming. We shall end it right here, right